I want this video to change your life a little bit because we're going to look at the powerful tactics Russian propaganda uses, how to protect yourself from them and keep yourself safe in your informational environment. We'll explain what Russian propaganda does in Russia, what it does when it projects into the West, and what happens when political actors in the West borrow techniques from Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda can be scarily brilliant, and it works very differently to Soviet propaganda, and it's with Soviet propaganda that we gotta start. To begin with, we gotta distinguish between alternate reality propaganda, propaganda that tries to peddle an alternative picture of the world, and manipulation of reality propaganda, propaganda that doesn't peddle an alternative picture but tries to distort your understanding of what reality is. Soviet propaganda was alternate reality propaganda. It was purposefully false information peddled at you, designed to persuade you of a coherent but false alternative picture of the world. If you were surrounded by weeds, the message was, there are no weeds, there are no weeds, there are no weeds, there are no weeds, there is pumpkins and sunflowers. And if you didn't believe, Soviet propaganda would escalate terror, or in softer times, keep pounding the message at you. And if you still didn't believe it, it'd say, okay, come here. Yeah, I mean, it's weeds everywhere. There aren't any pumpkins and sunflowers, but gotta keep saying there are, so come on, please, you can do it, okay? And it was in its soft incarnation when I met the regime as a school child under Gorbachev in the 1980s. Like all Soviet children, I was given a pin designating me a child of October 1917. I was told to say that I loved Lenin more than my parents, and that the Soviet military was great. But this was a case of alternate reality propaganda that was no longer believable for anybody. Everybody knew there were weeds, the Soviet economy was disintegrating, there were food shortages, and all this talk of greatness was captured by the great Russian aphorist Zhvanetsky, who said, "Our asses are naked, but our rockets fly far." This was old school Soviet propaganda. Whatever the weather, we're going to peddle alternate reality. But Russian propaganda, manipulation of reality propaganda, is very different. And it's to it that we now turn.
Любые переговоры с нацистами, пока твой сапог не стоит на их горле, воспринимается как слабость.
When we talk of Russian propaganda, you might, if you live in a Western democracy, say, oh, I recognize some of this. Some of it on a smaller scale is happening in my democracy. And you'd be right, and we're going to talk about that at the end of the video. But now we've got to realize that Russian propaganda starts by acknowledging a truth that the great British philosopher Bernard Williams put on the table 20 years ago. Two currents of ideas are very prominent in modern thought and culture. On the one hand, there is an intense commitment to truthfulness, or at any rate, a pervasive suspiciousness, a readiness against being fooled, an eagerness to see through appearances to the real structures and motives that lie behind them. Together with this demand for truthfulness, however, or to put it less positively, this reflex against deceptiveness, there is an equally pervasive suspicion about truth itself, whether there is such a thing. And these two things, the devotion to truthfulness and the suspicion directed to the very idea of truth, are connected to one another. The desire for truthfulness drives a process of criticism which weakens the assurance that there is any secure or unqualifiedly stateable truth. And what Bernard is saying, and he's writing over 20 years ago, before the existence of social media, is that we are so desperate not to get fooled, not to get duped, that we become suspicious not just of particular messages and particular messengers, but of the very idea of getting the world right at all. And Russian propaganda takes this to the limit. Its first pillar is to doubt truth itself. It rejects not just particular truths, but the very idea of there being a truth to be discovered. The second pillar of Russian propaganda is to give up on consistency. Remember, Soviet propaganda painted a consistent and coherent alternate picture of reality. Russian propaganda does not do that. It deliberately sends out mixed messages. Consistency is something that is to be positively evaded. The third pillar of Russian propaganda is volume. And here we've got this inconsistency that's contrived, put on steroids. So a multiplicity of mutually contradictory messages flooding the informational environment. The fourth pillar of Russian propaganda is that it starts with what already motivates you. It does not start with what it thinks should motivate you. So, oh, well, she should like Lenin. Lenin is good. Come on, let's get him to like Lenin. No. You like whatever you like. We're going to start with that, and then we're going to start manipulating this. So if you like donuts and you hate muffins, we're not going to persuade you that muffins are good. We're going to start by seeding all kinds of messages about donuts into your head, and then try to take you from there. We've got to slow down for a minute and look at a case study of what happened in Belarus in summer 2020, because mass protests were occurring against the so-called agro-Führer, the narcissist sicko Lukashenko, and Belarusian propaganda was losing. And suddenly Russian propagandists were sent in, and they completely changed the informational picture. The great YouTube colleague of mine, Maxim Katz, did a breakdown of this, and we're going to follow his analysis.
В Беларусь приехали российские пропагандисты. Сразу невооруженным глазом стали видны стандартные приемы нашей пропаганды. Во-первых, нужно понимать, что российские пропагандисты действуют намного более тонко, чем белорусские. Если белорусская пропаганда похожа на советскую, то есть просто фигарит альтернативную реальность в телевизор и не озабочена, чтобы в нее кто-то верил, то российская цепляется за реальные какие-то события или эмоции или чувства и пытается их раскрутить, чтобы люди сами прекратили сопротивление, переругались между собой, засомневались в своих лидерах, друг в друге, в себе, поверили, что ничего невозможно добиться и не надо даже пытаться. Это такая смесь политических технологий и социальной инженерии.
First move Russian propagandists made is to simply suspend the idea that Lukashenko won or that Lukashenko was a legitimate president, because that alternate reality wasn't saleable. So instead they refocused and messaged that the protest was about to expire, run out of steam and fade. Max described this as the Russians tapping into a learned helplessness that's common in the Soviet bloc, aiming to break the will of the protesters by tapping into their frustration. The second thing Russian propagandists did is changed from talking about Lukashenko to talking about Tikhanovskaya, who actually won the election. And the message was not Lukashenko is good, he is still the man, but Tikhanovskaya is unknown, she is a housewife, she can't really do politics. So that was a way of turning discourse onto defense about the legitimate winner of the election. The third thing Russians did was got the Belarusian regime to flood protesters with criminal proceedings, not so as to imprison everybody, but so as to change the discourse from where is the protest going next to who has been asked to go to a hearing and where, who's got charged, who's received what letter and notification. So this was an inversion of the informational environment. The fourth thing they did, having flooded the legal space, is that they flooded the social media space with posts and comments, and most importantly, these were messages that were contradictory and ill-assorted. Here are some of them. The opposition has gone mad. The opposition are outnumbered and in fact surrounded by enemies. If the opposition were to succeed, Belarus would lose key commercial ties with Russia. If the revolution did succeed, Belarus would become an American vassal. If the revolution did succeed, Belarus would lose the Russian language. Now, the point of saturating the informational environment with these ill-assorted messages was not to persuade people of them, but rather to get people to have arguments with bots and trolls and real agents for the Belarusian regime online. But even more importantly than that, to get for there to be divisions within the protest movement, so that people will start debating, well, maybe one of these arguments is more valid than another, maybe we should consider it. Well, no, we shouldn't, but yes, we should. So it's to seed conflict by saturating the informational environment with so many different messages, hoping some of them would cling to some of the people. So this is a little bit about how this stuff works. This is manipulation of reality propaganda, not alternate reality propaganda. Now, we have also seen this stuff being projected by the Russian regime into our democracies in the West, and we've got to talk about how that works. It's been a policy of the Russian regime for years to see destabilization in Western democracies. In 2016, they interfered in the US presidential election, as well as in the Brexit vote and in many other European countries. How did they do this, and what were their aims? In the US context, the Russians have been accused of three things. First of all, leaking and hacking the DNC emails, guilty as charged. 2, flooding the informational environment, so social media attacks, guilty as charged. Direct collusion with major US political figures. There's not much evidence for this. We've got to understand the three aims that the Russians had in interfering in Western democracies. The first thing to understand about what the Russians were up to in 2016 is that they are not into taking sides and genuinely supporting one candidate over another. They can support one candidate over another if they feel that's the candidate who will cause the most havoc. The approach in 2016 was that Trump doing well served their purposes. They actually thought Trump couldn't win, but they wanted Trump to do well because they thought that would create the biggest amount of tension, toxicity, and would to some extent undermine trust in America's democratic institutions. Strategically, they actually had some kind of a preference for Hillary because they thought that she'd be more predictable on the international stage. Cumulatively, they were more behind Trump, but that's not because they were with him as such. It's simply because they were looking for, well, what's going to cause the biggest degree of instability. The second thing that's really important to understand is that the Russians were not after seeding new conflict. They wanted to engage and deepen the conflicts that were already there. So if you're having a political fight with your neighbor or with somebody across a different part of town from you, the Russians are interested in that, and they want to get into that and maybe deepen it and maybe throw in some fuel onto the fire that's already burning between you and the other party you're in conflict with. So getting into what is already genuinely dividing people and trying to make it worse, not making up new stuff. The third aim of the Russians is so important to understand. We understand it so poorly that I want you to pay all the attention in the world that you possibly can at this point. The Russians are not thinking we're going to interfere in Western democracies and that's going to harm the democracies. No. They are thinking we're going to interfere in Western democracies. Westerners are going to freak out about our interference, and it's that freak out that will be what undermines Western democracy. You see, so for Putin, actors like Rachel Maddow, who take a very maximalist view of Russian interference, are inadvertently actually acting in Russia's interests. Because when we are having a panic attack about Russian intervention, Russian interference, that is the very harm that the Russians are looking for us to self-administer to our democracies. Because what are we doing when we do this? We are taking local issues that have some foreign cause but are mostly homegrown and pretending that they aren't local, pretending that they are a product of malign foreign interference. Yes, the Russians did play a role in the 2016 culture wars in the United States. Yes, the Russians did play a role in the Brexit Remain culture wars in the UK. But that role is minor compared with the maximalist accounts of it given by whether it's Rachel Maddow in the United States or Carol Cadwalladr in the UK. And so the fault here is that we are blinded to the local problems, the local conflicts we've got to process in our democracies, and end up prompted by this legitimately real foreign interference. We're prompted to externalize these local problems and say, as long as we stop the foreign interference, we're going to be okay. And so we're watching our democracy sink, pretending that there's nothing wrong with it because all of these foreign agents over there, and we're not recognizing that we should actually be urgently addressing what it is that might be, if not sinking the ship of our democracy that's locally caused, but at least taking it out of the bay into open ocean where waters will be bumpy, and for that we need to be prepared. We've discussed how Russian propaganda works on Russians, how it works on us when it's projected into the West, but there is something else disturbing we've got to discuss, and that is when we ourselves domestically begin to mimic some of the methods of Russian propaganda. Here is Peter Pomerantsev, who I want to put in here because he is anyway one of the best voices in the West on the workings of Russian propaganda.
America culturally has arrived to Russia in the early 1990s. Maybe not politically, of course, or in the sense of its institutions or in, its court systems and so on and so forth. I'm kind of talking about like the political culture. The permafrost underneath the institutions is melting in a very similar way.
So the winds of history are taking these Russian methods and seeding them in Western democracies. So just imagine Donald Trump being asked, Donald, do you like pasta? I've looked at pasta very, very strongly, tremendously strongly, and some very bad people, very, very bad, tremendously bad people have made pasta, and it was very bad. But I've made pasta, and it was really good. It was tremendously good, probably the best. And Vladimir Putin is a very smart guy, and he could make pasta tremendously well, but we don't like Putin, and his pasta probably wouldn't be very good, but I can't be sure, but it could be good, but I think it probably won't. So, you see what I mean? Donald Trump is doing one of these several things here. Trump is doing something that's basically a kind of cancellation of the idea that you can hold political speech accountable to truth, because Trump is doing something way worse than lying there. He's engaging in a kind of mixed messaging that is both designed for one and the same audience to seed doubt about trust itself and truth itself, but he's also directing messages simultaneously to different audiences, and he's trying to say everything and nothing at the same time. And this kind of contrived mixed messages is a thing that's way worse than systematic lying. Boris Johnson practices much the same in the UK, and one of his spiels during the pandemic has been to get people to wear masks without saying to them that they should wear masks. So he wanted people to wear masks but didn't want to be seen saying that masks are good. And so you saw the same kind of messaging from Johnson, who'd keep saying, well, masks are, really quite great, but no, I wasn't wearing one. I didn't really see the need to, but they're really great and they're really, really good, but I wouldn't wear one all the time. It just depends. So all of that is part of the same story of these ingredients being not quite borrowed from Russian propaganda, but as it were being blown over into our democracies by the winds of history. Let's swing back to the war and to Russia. What will happen over the next few weeks and months in Russia with this not alternate reality, but manipulation of reality propaganda, is that the Russians will try to use the techniques we've mentioned to sever in the minds of the population a connection between the war in Ukraine and the sanctions. As well as doing that, the Russians are going to keep clamping down and introducing more ingredients of terror into the regime. How far they will go and whether they could go so far that the regime topples upon itself is something that you can understand better by watching this video.